Through the first 58 years of the Super Bowl era, there have been 27,686 regular and postseason team games. Those encapsulate a lot of performances, both good and bad, by a lot of quarterbacks. One of the traditional, fundamental ways to assess these performances is with the metric passer rating. Passer rating is a complex mathematical formula that incorporates 4 different variables: completion percentage, yards per attempt, touchdown percentage, and interception percentage. But there is one major flaw that, to my knowledge, doesn't exist in any of the other rate metrics in any of the 3 sports with which I'm familiar. It frequently lies. For each of the 4 variables, the formulas within the formula, if you will, this metric decides it is simply unwilling to acknowledge numbers that fall below 0 or above 2.375. This is important and cannot be overstated. That is an arbitrary, man-made barrier that was baselessly implemented and skews how we perceive passer rating figures. So based on this formula and that quirky, artificial, random rule, if an NFL quarterback's performance in a given sample entails a completion percentage north of 77.5 or south of 30, it just pretends that those are the boundaries of the numeric counting system and rounds to those numbers, since that's what they'd need to be to keep the result between 0 and 2.375. If a quarterback completes every pass, the passer rating formula just decides that, nope, I'm gonna pretend that actually 22.5% of his passes were incomplete. Likewise, if a quarterback tosses an incompletion on every pass, it just pretends he actually completed 30% of his passes. For yards per attempt, no additional credit is given above 12.5, and the artificial floor below which the sliding scale inexplicably ends is 3. For touchdown percentage, since it's impossible to be in the negatives, the artificial and the actual floor are one and the same. But if a signal caller tops 11.875, sorry buddy, that's considered the highest number in existence here. And finally, for interception percentage, it's also impossible to be in the negatives, meaning the artificial and actual ceiling are one and the same. Though on the other side of the coin, anyone who tosses picks on more than 9.5% of his passes is spared the ridicule of the true number being reflected. We'll dive deeper into the specifics shortly, but ultimately this has marred the passer rating listed for thousands of games. Artificial ceilings and floors are simply lies, and they're lies that have by and large been blindly accepted without question or pushback for decades. Now, it is true that across big samples of full seasons or careers comprised by several hundred or more passes, these bullshit boundaries don't really ever come into play. Over an extended period, no NFL quarterbacks complete passes at a rate below 30% or above 77.5%, and they don't average over 12.5 or fewer than 3 yards per attempt. They don't launch touchdowns on more than 11.875% of attempts, and with the exception of 1947 Sid Luckman and 1962 George Blanda, who predate this era anyway, they don't toss picks on more than 9.5% of passes. But on smaller, game-level samples, the bullshit boundaries come into play a ton. As an example, let's take the top game authored by my personal all-time favorite quarterback, Steve Young. On December 19th, 1993, he completed 17 of 23 passes for 354 yards, 4 touchdowns, and no picks. That amounts to a 73.9 completion percentage, 15.4 yards per attempt, a 17.4 touchdown percentage, and obviously an interception percentage of 0. With the formula shortchanging Young and pretending he only averaged the upper boundary figures of 12.5 yards per attempt and an 11.875 TD percentage, that spits out an artificial rating of 155.3. But if the true numbers were utilized, 185.8, over 30 points better. In other words, the 155.3 is a lie. I don't like the lies. So I took a look at each and every game, that each and every quarterback played in each and every season of the Super Bowl era, and I rectified it. Here are each of the era's 24,492 instances as of 2024 in which an NFL quarterback threw at least 20 passes in a regular or postseason game, a number representing nearly 90% of the overall team games, meaning only particularly small samples are omitted. They're plotted by season and by what their actual passer rating would be if we just let nature take its course and apply the accurate, truthful number for each of the 4 passing variables, even if they're below 0 or above 2.375. If you squint really hard, you'll notice a few of them aren't quite readable. It's okay, we'll move forward anyway and do so with the benefit of mostly readable outliers. So just how prevalent are these phony barriers? Well, let's start with those outliers. With the artificial floor of 0 for each of the 4 variables, that means a lowest possible numerator here of 0, and thus an overall passer rating artificial floor that exists for some reason of 0. That would erroneously lead one to believe that there was a 20-way tie at 0 for the most inefficient passer rating games of the Super Bowl era. But instead we see that in reality, there were 178 games in which QBs finished a game with an actual passer rating in sub-0 land. And so this chart more properly separates and identifies the worst of the worst. On the other hand, with the artificial ceiling of 2.375 for each of the 4 variables, that means the highest possible numerator here is 9.5, which is then divided by 6 and multiplied by 100, and thus puts the overall passer rating artificial ceiling that exists for some reason at, and some of you dorks might already be familiar with this number, 158.3. So that's the math behind that, and that math would mistakenly lead one to believe there was a 38-way tie for the most efficient passer rating games of this era. But instead, we see that in reality, there were 201 instances in which QBs finished a game with an actual passer rating north of 158.3. And so this chart more properly separates and identifies the best of the best. Plenty more that weren't extreme outliers were nevertheless affected, for better or worse, by the artificial boundaries. Those 158.3s and zeros occur when all 4 metrics fall at or beyond the boundaries, but the passer ratings of more middle-of-the-road performances still become compromised if they happen to have 3, 2, or even 1 of the metrics fall beyond them. For instance, QBs have combined for 856 games in which they completed more than 77.5% of their passes. The 2.375 artificial ceiling from just that one element right there shortchanges nearly 900 performances. None more so than 2019 Drew Brees' in Week 15 when he completed all but 1 of his 30 passes. On the flip side, 137 player games came in under 30%, providing him with a bogus boost up to 30. None bigger than 1985 Dave Wilson, who opened the season by completing just 2 of 22 passes before getting yanked less than 3 quarters into the campaign. More than 220 of these games featured a QB that averaged over 12.5 yards per pass, with the most harm in that aspect inflicted on a 1967 Johnny Unitas game in Atlanta, where a full 6 yards per pass were chopped off for the purposes of passer rating for no reason whatsoever. Meanwhile, in a 1970 game in which in reality Billy Kilmer was swallowed up by the Purple People Eaters to the tune of not even matching his pass attempt total in passing yards, it just pretends that he had 3 times as many yards as attempts. Quarterbacks collectively had over 950 games throwing TDs on more than 11.875% of passes, with 1977 Bob Greasy not being thankful for drawing the ultimate short straw on Turkey Day when more than 26% of his 23 passes resulted in scores, only to be woefully under-recognized in the eyes of passer rating. And finally, in over 1,500 games, a quarterback threw an interception on more than 9.5% of his passes, with a trio that completed passes to the opposition on a quarter of their attempts getting the largest reprieve. Now, while many of those aforementioned games within the 4 passing variables overlap, overall more than 3,400, or about 1 in 7, of all these games are inaccurately portrayed by the NFL due to the nonsensical artificial bookends. With any simple percentage-based rate metric in any sport, it's impossible to be below 0 or above 100, and that's always accurately reflected. If an NBA player hits all 10 of his shots in a game, we say his field goal percentage that game was 100. We don't artificially cap it at like 84.2 and call that or anything above it perfect because we don't like dealing with numbers that realistically could only stem from smaller samples. And there's absolutely no reason for the same concept to not apply to all rate metrics, even the more complex beyond a simple percentage. For example, historically the average big league baseball player has an OPS of roughly 725, but if one were to theoretically homer on every plate appearance of a given sample, his OPS therein would and should be characterized as 5,000, regardless of whether or not that would look wonky. We don't randomly call an OPS of, say, 2,800 to be perfect, with any performance beyond that rendered moot. Same on the other extreme. Though no one posts an OPS of 0 across any sort of decent-sized sample, it's of course possible in a small sample. But there's not an artificial floor of, say, 300 to avoid wonkiness. People should have the option to embrace it. Besides, it's accepted that sample size would be inherently taken into account when dealing with rate metrics. That's why there are generally minimum qualifiers in connection with them. Ipso facto, the only ceiling that should exist within passer rating, the natural ceiling, and the number that should technically constitute perfection, is 831.25 in the theoretical scenario of every pass being a 99-yard touchdown. And the only floor that should exist, the natural floor, is negative 414.58 in the theoretical scenario of every pass being an interception. The artificial constraints of 0 and 2.375 within the individual variable formulas, leading to the bigger picture artificial constraints of 0 and 158.3, are unequivocally irrational. Now, with that mathematical atrocity fixed, we're able to assess what we're left with. With the true figures revealed, they're teeming with takeaways and anecdotes. From the majesty of Lamar Jackson's game that sits atop the throne, having taken the elevator more than 65 points above so-called perfection, to the majesty of Dan Pastorini taking the submarine nearly 60 points below 0, and everything in between. With the emergence of clarity and the appropriate numbers unearthed, we find so many quarterbacks that have crafted so many performances far better or worse than what has been inaccurately conveyed for decades, and it's important to shine a light on them, which we'll continue to do in the episodes to come. Thank you all so much for watching and supporting Secret Base. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you want to get access to even more and see your name included alongside all these other distinguished folks, subscribe to Secret Base on Patreon.